Dear students, very warm welcome to the lecture on Environmental Impact Assessment. Introduction. Environmental Impact Assessment, abbreviated as EIA, is a process of evaluating the likely environmental impacts of a proposed project or development, taking into account interrelated socio-economic, cultural and human health impacts, both beneficial and adverse. It is a tool used to identify the environmental, social and economic impacts of a project prior to decision making. It aims to predict environmental impacts at an early stage in project planning and design, find ways and means to reduce adverse impacts, shape projects to suit the local environment, and present the predictions and options to decision makers. By using EIA, both environmental and economic benefits can be achieved, such as reduced cost and time of project implementation and design, avoided treatment or cleanup costs, and impacts of laws and regulations. Moving ahead, let's learn components of environmental impact assessment. Environmental impact assessment is the process of assessing the likely environmental impacts of a proposal and identifying options to minimize environmental damage. The main purpose of EIA is to inform decision makers of the likely impacts of a proposal before a decision is made. EIA provides an opportunity to identify key issues and stakeholders early in the life of a proposal so that potentially adverse impacts can be addressed before final approval decisions are made. Although legislation and practice vary around the world, the fundamental components of an EIA would necessarily involve the following stages. Proposal identification. A large number of decisions are made at the project identification and proposal developmental stage. Screening to determine which projects or developments require a full or partial impact assessment study. Scoping to identify which potential impacts are relevant to assess based on legislative requirement, international conventions, expert knowledge and public involvement. To identify alternative solutions that avoid, mitigate or compensate adverse impacts on biodiversity, including the option of not proceeding with the development, finding alternative designs or sites which avoid the impacts, incorporating safeguards in the design of the project, or providing compensation for adverse impacts, and finally to derive terms of reference for the impact assessment. Impact analysis. Assessment and evaluation of impacts and development of alternatives to predict and identify the likely environmental impacts of a proposed project or development, including the detailed elaboration of alternatives. Mitigation. Where impact analysis identifies that a development is likely to give rise to significant remedy. Environmental statement. Report the environmental impact statement, abbreviated as EIS, or EIA report, including an environmental management plan, abbreviated as EMP, and a non-technical summary for the general audience. Review. Review of the environmental impact statement based on the terms of reference and public participation. Decision making on whether to approve the project or not and under what conditions, and follow up, monitoring, compliance, enforcement and environmental auditing. Monitor whether the predicted impacts and proposed mitigation measures occur as defined in the EMP. Verify the compliance of proponent with the EMP to ensure that unpredicted impacts or failed mitigation measures are identified and addressed in a timely fashion. Proposal identification. A large number of decisions are made at the project identification and proposal development stage. Decisions are made regarding the location of the development, and the land uses the development will cater for the scale, layout and design of the development. If environmental issues are considered at this point in the development process, impacts can be significantly reduced and in some cases removed altogether. The advantages and disadvantages of the alternatives should be investigated, not only in environmental terms but also in terms of cost effectiveness, reasonableness and feasibility. The assessment of alternatives will result in the development of a preferred project proposal, which should then be the subject of a screening assessment. Screening. Screening is undertaken to decide whether an EIA is required and focus resources on projects most likely to have significant impacts, those where impacts are uncertain and those where environmental management input is likely to be required. Official EIA guidelines usually contain lists or schedules specifying which developments require an EIA. These criteria include development characteristics, characteristics of the location and characteristics of potential effects. Scoping. During the scoping stage, the key issues that EIA will address are identified. Effective scoping will ensure that the EIA focuses on those areas where significant effects are likely. Therefore, preventing resources being used to address issues where no significant effects are likely. A good scoping process will consist of three key components. Number 1. Consultation with relevant stakeholders and interested parties to provide them with information on the development proposal and what technically appear to be the key issues, and to find out what their key concerns are regarding the location and the development proposal. Number 2. Analysis of the issues identified during consultation to determine which are likely to be significant and therefore must be included within the scope of the EIA. And number 3. Negotiation with the decision makers and other interested parties to refine the scope of the EIA. There are a number of issues that are concerned within the scope of the majority of EIAs. These include landscape and visual, ecology, land use, traffic and transport, air quality, noise, water, ground conditions, archaeology and cultural heritage. Impact analysis. Impact analysis involves characterizing the impact in terms of its likely nature, spatial and temporal distribution, duration, frequency, reversibility and magnitude. Finally, a judgment must be made as to whether the impact is likely to be significant or not. A large number of impact analysis techniques exist. Each have their advantages and disadvantages. Impact analysis techniques can be quantitative or qualitative. Quantitative techniques tend to involve a prescriptive method being set out and followed, whereas qualitative techniques rely less upon a prescribed method, instead relying heavily upon professional judgment. The nature of the environmental media being assessed will determine the most appropriate impact analysis technique. Mitigation. Where impact analysis identifies that a development is likely to give rise to significant environmental impacts, mitigation measures are proposed to avoid, reduce and if possible remedy them. As mentioned briefly in the section on proposal identification above, mitigation measures can be incorporated into the design of the development. End of pipe mitigation measures can also be incorporated into the development at a later stage. Environmental statement. The environmental statement is the vehicle used to communicate the results of the EIA to the decision maker and other stakeholders in the development process. The environmental statement should objectively document the EIA process and findings, giving equal prominence to positive and negative impacts relative to their importance. The ES should be clear and concise. Because non-specialists are likely to read the document, technical language should be avoided. Any necessary technical information should be provided in appendices. Review. Quality control is an important stage in any EIA. A review of the quality of the environmental statement is a way of demonstrating that the ES has met all the appropriate legal requirements. The ES contains sufficient information to allow a decision to be made, and the ES is consistent with current good practice. A review of the ES can be undertaken at the draft stage or after finalization. The earlier the review takes place, the greater the influence it can have over the quality of the ES. Decision making. This is the point in the process where the development is either granted planning permission or not. It is necessary at this stage for the environmental statement to be made available to a number of statutory consultees, the public and other stakeholders. When a decision on the application, decision makers are required to consider all relevant environmental information, including the environmental statement and the opinions of statutory consultees, the public and other stakeholders. Environmental information is only one of many material considerations that the decision maker must take into account. The decision maker will also consider social and economic information, current planning policies and the relevant local development framework or local plan. The final decision will be based upon all of these things. Follow up. Follow up is very important in EIA. It is the stage where the mitigation measures proposed within the environmental statement are actually implemented. It is also the stage where any necessary monitoring of impacts is undertaken. A common tool is employed for ensuring that the measures proposed implemented is a management plan or not. Management plans demonstrate a clear commitment to monitoring and mitigation measures and illustrates that the developer values the environment and the EIA process. Furthermore, let us discuss the importance of environmental impact assessment. The Convention on Biological Diversity, that is CBD, the Ramsar Convention and the Convention on the Conservation of Migratory Species of Wild Animals, that is CMS, recognize impact assessment as an important tool for helping, and it ensures that development is planned and implemented with biodiversity in mind. The CBD requests parties to apply impact assessment to projects, programs, plans and policies with potential negative impact on biodiversity. Biodiversity is relevant to all types of impact assessment and should be addressed at all levels, from environmental impact assessment carried out for individual projects, that is EIA, to the strategic environmental assessment of policies, plans and programs, that is SEA. Its values should be addressed in social impact assessment, health impact assessment and may need to consider the role of biodiversity in disease transmission or biological control. Finally, biodiversity provides commodities for international trade that may be the subject of study in trade impact assessment, sometimes referred to as sustainability impact assessment. EIA procedures should refer to other relevant national, regional and international legislation, regulations, guidelines and other policy documents such as the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan documents, the CBD and biodiversity related conventions and agreements, including in particular the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Fauna and Flora, that is CITES, the CMS and related agreements, the Convention on Wetland, the Convention on Environmental Impact Assessment in a Transboundary Context, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, the European Union Directives on Environmental Impact Assessment, and the Protocol for the Protection of the Mediterranean Sea against pollution from land-based sources. Consideration should be given to improving integration of NBSAPs and national development strategies using SEA as a tool for such integration to promote the establishment of clear conservation targets through the NBSAP process. These targets should then be used for the screening and scoping of targets of EIA and for developing mitigation measures. Benefits of environmental impact assessment. The benefits of EIA can be direct, such as the improved design or location of a project, or indirect, such as better quality EIA work or raised environmental awareness of the personnel involved in the project. In general, the benefits of EIA include better environmental planning and design of a proposal. Carrying out an EIA entails an analysis of alternatives in the design and location of projects. This can result in the selection of an improved technology, which lowers waste outputs, or an environmentally optimum location for a project. A well-designed project can minimize risks and impacts on the environment and people, and thereby avoid associated costs of remedial treatment or compensation for damage. Ensuring compliance with environmental standards. Compliance with environmental standards reduces damage to the environment and disruption to communities. It also avoids the likelihood of penalties, fines, and loss of trust and credibility. Savings in capital and operating costs. EIA can avoid the undue costs of unanticipated impacts. These can escalate if environmental problems have not been considered from the start of proposal design and require rectification later. An anticipate and avoid approach is much cheaper than react and cure. Generally, changes which must be made late in the project cycle are the most expensive. Reduced time and costs of approvals of developmental applications. If all environmental concerns have been taken into account properly before submission for project approval, then it is unlikely that delays will occur as a result of decision makers asking for additional information or alterations to mitigation measures. Increased project acceptance by the public. This is achieved by an open and transparent EIA process with provision of opportunities for public involvement of people who are most directly affected by and interested in the proposal in an appropriate way that suits their needs. Environmental impact assessment in United States of America. United States of America was the first country to develop a system of environmental impact assessment. When Silent Spring, written by Rachel Carson, was published in 1962, social awareness to environmental issues in the US had reached high proportions and grew as very intense movements in the later half of 1960s. With these social backgrounds, the National Environmental Policy Act 1969 of the United States of America, that is NEPA, was constituted, and for the first time EIA requiring environmental consideration in large scale projects was enforced as legislation. Generally, EIA is more efficient and effective to be implemented as early as possible, for example, at the policy or project planning phase. In practice, however, the implementation period of the EIA as well as its scope and procedures vary by each country and agency, and each system holds their own unique characteristics. Environmental impact assessment in India. The Ministry of Environment and Forests of India have been in a great effort in environmental impact assessment in India. The main laws in nation are the Indian Wildlife Act 1972, the Water Act 1974, the Air Act 1981 and the Environment Act 1986. The responsible body for this is Central Pollution Control Board. EIC is the repository of one-stop secondary data source for environmental impact assessment in India. History of environmental impact assessment in India. The Indian experience with environmental impact assessment began over 30 years back. It started in 1976-1977 when the Planning Commission asked the Department of Science and Technology to examine the river valley projects from environmental angle. This was subsequently extended to cover those projects which required approval of the Public Investment Board. Till 1994, the environmental clearance from the central government was an administrative decision and lacked the legislative support. On 27 January 1994, the Union Ministry of Environment and Forests, Government of India, under the Environmental Act 1986, promulgated EIA notification of making environmental clearance, that is EC, mandatory for expansion or modernization of any activity or for setting up new projects listed in Schedule 1 of the notification. Since then, there have been 12 amendments made in EIA notification of 1994. The Indian experience. Experience on environmental impact assessment, that is EIA in India, indicates that lack of availability of timely and reliable environmental data has been the major bottleneck in preparing quality EIA reports. Since environment is a multidisciplinary area, a multitude of agencies are involved in the collection of environmental data in India. However, there is no single organization in India that tracks the data available among the multitude of data generators and makes it available in the form and manner required by the practitioners in the field of EIA. This in turn affects the effectiveness of EIA process by causing delays in conducting EIAs and in reviewing the EIA reports for environmental clearance, that is EC. Further, the environmental data is often not available in a processed or value-added form that can possibly enhance the quality of environmental decision making to address these issues. Environmental Information Center, abbreviated as EIC, was conceived to act as a clearinghouse of environmental data needed for preparation and review of EIAs. EIC data is also used as a project level decision support system for site selection, ecological degradation or improvements over time, early warning system for glacier lake outbursts, catchment area degradation and determination of environmental status. Drawbacks in the Indian system. One of the biggest concerns with the environmental clearance process is related to the quality of EIA report that is being carried out. The reports are generally incomplete and provided with false data. EIA reports ignore several aspects while carrying out assessments, and significant information is found to be omitted. Many EIA reports are based on single season data and are not adequate to determine whether environmental clearance should be granted. All this makes the entire exercise contrary to its very intent. It is being found that the team formed for conducting EIA studies is lacking the expertise in various fields such as anthropologists and social scientists or even wildlife experts. There is a lack of exhaustive ecological and socio-economic indicators for impact assessment. Public comments are not taken into account at the early stage, which often leads to conflict at the later stage of project clearance. There is always a lack of reliable data sources. The secondary data is also not reliable. The data collectors do not pay respect to the indigenous knowledge of local people. The credibility of the primary data collected by the data collectors is doubtful. The detailed method used for the prediction and evaluation of the project is not mentioned in the report. Limited explanations are given both to quantitative estimation of magnitude of impact and to the assumption and judgments used in the evaluation of impacts. The limited coverage of scoping is confined mainly to direct impacts. Details regarding the effectiveness and implementation of mitigation measures are often not provided. Often and more so far, strategic industries such as nuclear energy projected, the EMPs are kept confidential for political and administrative reasons. Emergency preparedness plans are not discussed in sufficient detail and the information not disseminated to the communities. Let us summarize the topic. Environmental Impact Assessment, that is EIA, is practiced worldwide but differing greatly in procedures and practices. Most countries have well-defined procedures for carrying out EIA, though in practice it may be poorly done. Well-defined procedures for EIA but poor practices are not uncommon in most developing countries. Categorization of projects is based on factors such as type, magnitude, capacity, cost, duration, location and impact significance. In all countries, the EIA process begins when a proponent applies to the appropriate authority for permission to undertake an activity or project. Screening determines whether a project requires EIA or not. The most common screening procedure involves the use of lists with thresholds set by project cost, location, size, type or capacity. Some countries have discretionary lists which enlist projects not covered in term of threshold in the inclusion and exclusion lists. Decision on EIA requirements for such projects is dependent on location and level of significance of impact. Most countries' scoping involves the proponent, affectees, experts and the public. However, in China, the action outline which provides the scope is given by a licensed agency and approved by the state's environmental authority. Scoping is not mandatory in Pakistan, hence the proponent decides what to include. The state's environmental authority only plays a suggestive role in this stage. Globally, the impact assessment is mostly conducted by the proponent in developed countries, but in developing countries, a licensed agency or the state's environmental authority does the assessment. The cost of the assessment, however, is borne by the proponent in all countries. Public participation in the EIA process is not uncommon in developed countries, but much limited in developing countries. Though there are great variations in EIA procedures and practices, the contents of EIA report are much similar with little variations. Thank you.